In the quiet town of Willowbrook, where white picket fences gleamed and neighbors greeted each other with warm smiles, no one suspected the horror lurking beneath the surface. Olivia Carter was a devoted mother to her cheerful 2-year-old son, Benjamin, until the day she noticed his strange, persistent itching. What began as a mother's concern soon spiraled into a nightmare of betrayal, conspiracy, and unspeakable evil. Let us know where you're watching from and what time you found this video. We read every single comment. The Carter family seemed to be the epitome of perfection in the lovely and apparently idyllic hamlet of Willowbrook, Illinois, where white picket fences shone brightly in the afternoon sun and neighbors greeted one another with pleasantries over freshly made pies. Benjamin Carter, who was just 2 years old at the time, was a lovable youngster with golden curls and a giggle that could warm even the most dispassionate of hearts. Olivia Carter was his mother, and she doted on him never-endingly, making sure that his environment was as secure and loving as it could possibly be. On the other hand, something ominous was growing under the surface of this pleasant household environment. Benjamin would wriggle and writhe in his high chair, his little hands tearing at his diaper. This was the beginning of the problem. At first, Olivia thought it was only a slight rash and used lotions and powders to treat it. However, the behavior continued to become worse. At that moment, his once jovial chuckles transformed into whimpers of pain, and his sparkling blue eyes were clouded with something that Olivia was unable to name, and that something was dread. Over the course of many weeks, Olivia's disquiet developed into a full-blown fear. The pain that Benjamin experienced was not a random occurrence. Rather, it occurred at specified periods, including after his grandpa, Harold, had spent time alone with him. With a kind grin and a fondness for giving sweets to the children in the neighborhood, Harold Carter was a respected member of the community. He had retired from teaching and was a school teacher. Without a doubt, no one would ever accuse him of doing anything odd. However, Olivia's maternal instincts shouted that there was a significant problem with the situation. When Olivia pretended to leave the home one afternoon, she did so under the premise of conducting errands. However, she really left the front door slightly ajar and lurked behind the couch in the living room, filming her phone. The events that followed would torment her for the rest of her life. When Harold entered the room, his normally cheery mood seemed to change the instant he realized he was by alone. While he was leaning over Benjamin's crib, his voice, which was normally sweet and soothing, became cold. "What a mischievous young man you have been, haven't you? Are you going to talk to your mother about our little secret?" Benjamin let out a moan because his little body was shaking. After then, Harold had the unimaginable happen. The weird powdered material was contained inside a little glass vial that he took out of his pocket and filled with it. He put his finger inside and sprinkled it into Benjamin's diaper while pressing it on his skin. He did this with a terrifying smirk on his face. Blood began to run cold in Olivia. As Harold's face contorted in anger, she screamed and ran out of her hiding spot, grabbing Benjamin and removing him from the situation. An instant contact was placed to the authorities, and when they tested the material, the results were even more horrible than Olivia could have ever believed was possible. Fiberglass that has been crushed up. Benjamin was suffering from an intolerable itching and rash that was caused by Harold's practice of sprinkling minute shards of fiberglass into his diaper. This was a cruel kind of torture that was camouflaged as a simple rash. However, the issue that remained was why. The more the detectives delved, the more they discovered about Harold's troubled history. Prior to becoming a well-liked educator, he had been fired from a different school for reasons that remain a mystery. Ex-students have come forward to share their experiences of being picked out by him and experiencing rashes that cannot be explained. However, what is the most unsettling discovery? There was more to this than Harold just doing it for fun. He was doing experiments. His perverted mind was under the impression that he could entirely control a kid if he could teach them to link pain with disobedience. Benjamin was the most recent issue he dealt with. The residents of Willowbrook were put in a state of disbelief, and their confidence was broken. Olivia, who having been through a traumatic experience, went on to become a champion for child safety, guaranteeing that no other parent would go through what she had. What about Harold, then? He never again saw the outside of a cell that he was incarcerated in. Are you Benjamin? His childhood was free of the itching. Nevertheless, the wounds, both visible and invisible, would never disappear. Despite the fact that the arrest of Harold Carter sent shockwaves across Willowbrook, the horror was not yet finished. As Olivia sat in her living room, clinging to Benjamin tightly, her phone began to buzz incessantly. It was messages from other parents which were first reluctant, but eventually poured in like floods bursting through a dam. My daughter had the same rash last year. The doctors said it was eczema, but it only happened after my son stayed with his uncle. Olivia, it is imperative that we have a conversation. It's not simply Harold to blame. She scrolled with her hands shaking as she did so. Harold wasn't acting on his own either. The primary detective on Harold's case, Detective Rebecca Shaw, had a sneaking suspicion that something more sinister was going on from the very beginning. It was not something that the typical individual simply had sitting around. Rather, fiberglass was something that was industrial and specialized. What about Harold's unruffled manner when he was being questioned? Too much experience. Police discovered ledgers during their search of his residence. Names, dates, and symptoms are all required. The names of the children. And next to each name, there is a counterpart, one who has been of assistance. Dr. Ethan Price, the well-liked doctor in Willowbrook, was found to have been involved, which was the most unsettling finding. In reality, the individual who had disregarded Benjamin's rashes as common irritation was the one who was providing Harold with fiberglass powder and cleaning up the evidence. But why is that? Detective Shaw decided to dig further. Price's medical license had been revoked in another state many years ago due to the fact that he violated ethical standards by conducting experiments on foster children. Following his disappearance, he reappeared in Willowbrook, but this time under a different identity. Is that Harold? But he was more than simply a granddad. Price's previous town was where he had worked as a teacher in the past. Even terrible than anybody could have anticipated was the reality. Both Price and Harold were participants in a bizarre psychological experiment that had been going on for many decades. The experiment included testing pain-based training on youngsters. They were under the impression that if a kid could be schooled via the experience of suffering, then they could be shaped into the ideal subjects who would obey. In addition, Willowbrook, with its dependable and tightly knit population, was the ideal place to go hunting or fishing. As the scope of the inquiry expanded, parents came forward with horrifying accounts, including the following. A little girl who would scream whenever she was touched on the shoulder, which was the location where Price had administered a dose of a mild irritant to her as part of a vaccine. An example of a youngster who refused to consume food after being given meals that included capsaicin in an effort to teach him discipline. The disappearances are the worst problem of all. There have been 3 cases of youngsters going missing after attending Price's clinic during the course of the last 5 years. The tests were unsuccessful, right? Or had they been transported to a more undesirable location? An abandoned farmhouse on the outskirts of town was located by the police after they conducted a frantic search. What is underneath it? An underground bunker. A limited number of rusting cages, medical equipment, and shackles were discovered within the building. No children, however. In a hurry, there was just one note that was left behind. Subject 12 has been moved to a new location. The work is still ongoing, Neither Price nor Harold were the only ones involved. This was not the only one. Also, they were still present throughout the world. Things would never be the same in Willowbrook again. The parents went away, the number of lawsuits increased, and the streets, which were previously quiet, now bore a sense of impending anxiety. While Olivia and Benjamin were leaving town, she made a solemn promise. "I will find the rest of them. Also, what about Price?" It was the night before his trial when his body was discovered inside his cell. According to them, suicide. The syringe imprint that was found on his neck, however, revealed a different narrative. Someone had put an end to his voice. Consequently, this indicated that the experiment was still active. Although it had been a year since Olivia and Benjamin had left Willowbrook, the dreams continued to plague them like never before. She was able to see them each and every time she closed her eyes. The cages, the needles, and the ledger that had Benjamin's name inside of a red circle. Then the email came at that moment. No name given. Without a trace. Subject 12 is still alive at this time. Come meet me in the old mill if you are interested in finding the other people. At midnight. Come by yourself. The mill stood prominently in the shadows, its shattered windows acting as if they were watching her with empty eyes. She was no longer naive, and Olivia firmly grasped the pepper spray that she had in her pocket. There was a person that emerged from the darkness. Miss Mira Langley, the nurse who had previously worked at Price's clinic. One of the few individuals who had not been imprisoned. "You need to see this," Mira murmured to Olivia as she pressed a USB stick into her hand. "This is not only an experiment being conducted on them. Changes are being made to them." When Olivia got back to her room at the hotel, she plugged the drive-in. It was a grainy surveillance film that suddenly sprang to life. There is a clean white room. A youngster, identified as Subject 12, shackled to a table. There was something that Price injected into their spine as he bent over them. From that point on, the shouting began. However, it was not the cry of a youngster. There was something more profound. "It's not true." At a later point in time, the film switched to the child's fingers becoming longer. The pupils in their eyes dilated into lines. After that, they ran through the constraints like paper, tearing them apart. In the depths of the forest, Mira's coordinates lead to a defunct mental health facility that had been abandoned. They moved the children here after the raid, according to her account. They call it the nursery. Olivia's blood became chilled to the bone, due to the fact that if the youngsters were still at large, in what form had they evolved? A basement entry was used by them to gain entry. Aromas of disinfectant and something horribly sweet could be detected in the air. Then they heard a low clicking sound with a guttural quality. The first kid manifested themselves from the darkness. Eyes that are dark, extremely large mouth, fingers that terminate in bony tips that are sharp. But what is the worst of it all? Benjamin's voice questioned, "Mama?" in a raspy manner. Olivia took a little step back. She was recognized by it. The sound of gunfire reverberated as Mira's spotlight swung randomly. Rather of being insects, the animals, which were really youngsters, crawled down the walls. One made a lunge. Olivia narrowly evaded the attack, and she perceived the sound of claws whizzing by her ear. Only a few of them managed to escape alive. On the next morning, the hospital was completely destroyed by fire. There were no corpses discovered. A fire caused by electricity was described by the news. But Olivia was aware of the reality. It is still possible to find them. We are waiting, altering oneself, developing further than one day. They are going to return.